Started when I went to Mexico in 1995 on a sort of mad mission. I'd sort of really joined a cult, I realized later. I sort of joined a cult, and I ended up in Mexico in this extraordinary place called the Sierra 14, which is above the sacred peyote desert of the Huichol Indians. Extraordinary place, and within days of arriving there, things started to go extremely strange, and I was suddenly living in a sort of Carlos Castaneda novel. I call them novels because they're probably all fiction, but I think Castaneda had a pretty good idea of how this stuff works, which is essentially when you step into a reality which isn't quite the same as what you're used to. And bizarre things start to happen, strange coincidences, and signs which are so impossible to avoid, you're literally tripping over them. And I started having a very traumatic time with the dynamics of the cult, I suppose, in a sense. And I ended up mercifully, through a magical series of events, ending up being invited to live in a cave up in the mountains in the middle of nowhere by this saintly family of goat herders. And so there I was living in La Cueva de la Leona, and having a very magical experience, literally like St. Francis of Assisi, with birds almost eating out of my hands, and all that sort of Native American medicine idea of everything you see as a sign. It might be a plant, it might be an animal, it might be a bird, and I was really starting to get the signs. And within a short space of time, I borrowed a book from a friend's little magical bookshelf in the Café del Nahual called The Practical Handbook of Plant Alchemy by Professor Manfred M. Junius. And I was interested in alchemy. I'd read a history of alchemy. I'd read Holmyard's history of alchemy. I had a sort of reasonable idea about it, but I didn't really get it, and I didn't know to what degree it was symbolic, or it was meant to be an internal, inner spiritual path, or whether the practical side of it had any validity at all. But when I read Professor Junius's book, within 3 chapters, I was going, aha. This is what alchemy is really about. And within 5 chapters, I was saying, oh my God, this is what I want to do. I want to do this. Which basically starting off making potions, initially herbal potions, according to alchemical processes and principles, which by then had been so brilliantly delineated by him and put in such a context that they made complete sense. So I surrendered, this is what I want to do. Eventually I came back from Mexico because it seemed to me that the constraints of the cave were going to make laboratory work a little hard, although I realized I could have done it there. I had a plentiful supply of ancient goat shit, and ancient goat shit is a very good source of heat and very controllable, and with the furnace you can get it roaring hot, but I was a beginner and I didn't really realize that. So I came back to the UK. And it was really, the book's dedicated to my godchildren, because I came back and of course my friends and family started referring to me as the alchemist, insisted on putting that hat on me, which is a hat I have never willingly put on my head. But there you go. If you talk about alchemy the entire time, what do you expect? So when I used to see my godchildren, they would, the parents would tease their kids, say, oh, your godfather the alchemist is coming. They had no idea what that meant until they started reading Harry Potter, and suddenly Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and there's Nicholas Flamel, the famous ancient alchemist, who turns out to be a real person. So they'd ask, do you know about Nicholas Flamel, the alchemist? I go, yes. Was he real? I go, yes. Did he really discover the Philosopher's Stone? I go, well, so the legend says. And then as they got older, they started asking more leading questions, not just about famous magicians, historical magicians, who are also in Harry Potter, such as Cornelius Agrippa, but then more leading questions about whether there was really anything in all this wonderful, exciting, magical nonsense at all. by which time I had been studying esoteric currents apart from alchemy for quite some time, and of course I'd encountered all kinds of extraordinary historical characters, like, you know, Dr. John Dee, Paracelsus, I mean, loads. So I thought of the idea of Book of Wizards. I got into writing by accident when a friend of mine used to churn out what I call esoteric light books, probably quite a few of his books here. Richard Craze, R.I.P., God bless him, rang me up one day and said, "Guy, I've been asked to write a book, love potions. Not really my bag, but I thought you'd do a wizard job of it, so I told them to contact you. £2,000, it's a straight fee, churn it out in 4 weeks. 3, if you like. Off you go." So okay. So I agreed to write the book. It had already been pre-sold to 20 different territories, and it was going to be translated into 20 different languages, and I was already told I couldn't write about any illegal substances, so it was just a little package book. But it sold an awful lot of copies, and then they asked me if I'd write another one. The commissioning editor rang me and said, "Guy, what do you know about angels?" I said, "Well, I just decided I believe in angels." She said, "Marvellous, do you want to write a book about them?" And I said, "Well, I don't know much about them." She said, "But you will do, won't you, Guy?" And I said, I suppose I will. So I wrote that one, and that sold 300,000 copies in 24 languages or something. And so it was my idea for the Book of Wizards was going to be a sort of top trumps churned out in a small little square, you know, sort of gift book thing. So Wizards top trumps. And then the book industry started hitting a slump. This was about 2000, and they pulled out of that idea. So it just sat on the shelf for quite a while. But then my publisher, John Martineau, who I did a book called, a little wooden book called The Alchemist's Kitchen, asked me if I had any more ideas, and I mentioned the Wizards idea, and he was very taken with it. So eventually I got round to writing up a synopsis, and blah, blah, blah. Here it comes. In terms of actually how the book unfolded, I've got my friend Frank Mollett really to thank, because he introduced me to this extraordinary artifact, the most ancient figurative piece of art ever discovered, known as the Lion Man. How many people have heard of the Lion Man? The Löwenmensch. So we made a pilgrimage to Ulm, city on the Danube where Einstein was born, where this extraordinary thing is housed. And that started off a line of inquiry into the real ancients, and an understanding that although this thing is 44,000 years old, that the people who made it were clearly as conscious as we are. And so there was an idea that this had some kind of totemic significance that we can only guess at, but magic had to be involved in one way or another. Deep sort of cave prehistory start, and from then on it was just coming out of the mists of deep history into ancient history. And I started off with Orpheus, who I remember from my Greek mythology. I loved Greek mythology when I was a kid. I'd read Homer twice by the age of 12, which now strikes me as completely bizarre, and what a weirdo I must have been. Fortunately, I was really into T-Rex as well, so I wasn't a complete nerd. But it was great tapping back into that and starting to see between the mythology of where that was tapping into an esoteric current that we can now recognize from a more modern perspective. And I found that by the time I got to people like Pythagoras, that this idea of deep cave magic, which the Lion Man had triggered in me, obviously crops up in Orphism as an initiatic tradition, supposedly founded by this guy whose main story we know of is his descent into the underworld, and his and that seems to be core to the initiatic aspect of what came to be known as Orphism. And by the time I got to Pythagoras and unravelled that these days academics are now happy to accept that Orphism and Pythagoreanism run pretty well hand in hand, They might be parallel trends to a certain extent, but they seem to be deeply intermingled. And discovered in my attempts to unravel the deeply tangled and highly legendary and mostly mythical details of Pythagoras' life, that he was deeply involved in initiatic cave traditions. And it seemed to me, after a lot of reading, that essentially he was tapping into an ancient tradition using very specific techniques that we could most simply describe, I think, as sensory deprivation techniques, to have encounters, revelatory encounters with what seemed to them the Godhead, Apollo shining in the darkness, what I tend to call the apparent other. And he was, as it were, coming out of the cave, rather like Neo in the Matrix, going, I got geometry. So this seemed a very important thing to me, that the roots of Western philosophy itself, not just the esoteric tradition, but the roots of Western philosophy itself is based not on discursive thought. It's not pen and paper or, stick and clay working out mathematical formulae. It's not based on logic. It's not based on this sort of discursive thought processes. The initiatory point, the trigger point, is information downloaded, as it were, whole through revelatory, what we might call shamanic techniques. And of course, this then covered quite a lot of my considerations in terms of how the esoteric tradition in the West, as it has come down to us, unfolded. So that's what you're going to find in the book. Volume 1, it was meant to be the history of magic and alchemy from year dot to Crowley, and probably leave it at that, so as not to step on the toes of any living magicians. But by the time my final deadline had expired, I had to send off the manuscript as it was and tack on a few sort of chapters on alchemy to sort of round it off. And I didn't hear from the publishers for 6 weeks, and it wasn't the book they'd signed off on at all, and 6 weeks is a long time to wait when you think you've probably blown it. But then when they did get back to me, they were effusive in their enthusiasm. So I said, well, if you like it, there's plenty more where that came from. And so they went for 2 more volumes, and now it's a trilogy, with 2 more to come, one coming out next year and the other in due course. And it's been great fun to do. It's great to see it out in print after all these years. And I'm very grateful to friends and family who've supported me and insisted that I pursue this to the end. And my publishers, Llewellyn, some of the first esoteric books I bought were by Llewellyn, and there are many on the shelves here. And I'd like to thank them for being brilliant publishers. Yes, the apparent other. Well, I say apparent because it seems to me that the focus of the whole esoteric enterprise is to find down as deeply as possible to what our identity is. So the individual practitioner, we imagine with the pointing hat and wands and spells and everything, that it's all about powers. And that those powers are so that you can take control of the environment. But the deeper esoteric tradition definitely comes from a pursuit for truth with a capital T, and trying to find where we as individuals stand in relationship to such a thing as truth, and whether that thing can be encountered. And it seems that people like Pythagoras and Parmenides, some of the other so-called pre-Socratic philosophers like Empedocles, they are trying to get as close to the divine, or their idea of the divine, which I tend to call the other, as closely as possible. And if I'm right in terms of these encounters they're having deep in the darkness, encountering what they consider Apollo shining in the darkness, That is the other in the direct encounter. By the time you get to Neo-Platonists such as Plotinus, his focus is on henosis, which is the direct encounter with the divine, but that encounter where you are dissolved in union with the divine. So once you're dissolved in union with the divine, there is no separation. So that other that we seek to unite with is only apparently other, because in the end there is no separation at all. And of course this ties in with Buddhist concepts and also Hindu concepts, and is a widely understood concept, at least in esoteric currents throughout the world, and probably going way back. Pythagoras goes off on this magical journey to the east. He goes to Egypt, and I think it's pretty well established that he almost certainly did go to Egypt. The tyrant of Samos, the island that he was born on, he had a close relationship with the pharaoh of Egypt at the time, and so the opportunity for him to go there as a standout young man of enormous genius, in a sense, would almost certainly have taken up that opportunity to go to Egypt. So in terms of the magic coming out, when he goes off on his travels, after he's been to maybe Babylon as well, meeting all the ancients and all the priests, he makes a beeline to Crete to meet Epimenides. And Epimenides is what I call the tattooed cave prophet. And he is the original Rip Van Winkle. And he comes out of a cave where he goes, I think he's herding goats. And he goes into the cave for a sleep, rather like Rip Van Winkle up in the Catskills. And when he comes back down to his village, his brother, who he doesn't recognizes him, and practically passes out because some 23 years has passed. And Epimenides has got all this wisdom and all this knowledge, and it's not just wisdom and knowledge and know-how. He actually has the ability, for example, to cure plagues. And his renown was such that we have historical evidence preserved to this day of how the Athenians invited him to Athens to cure a plague that they were suffering from, and we know exactly what techniques he used, and that the cure was effective, apparently. And with Pythagoras as well, these people, with their extraordinary powers of understanding, seem to have had occult powers in terms of weather magic, being able to control the weather on the one hand, and affect changes in people, like healing, rather like Jesus, casting out of demons, all kinds of stuff which we associate maybe more with Eastern traditions these days, sort of fakirs on the one hand, or certain sadhus, you know, think of the Indian rope trip and stuff like that. So to what degree charlatanism was involved and sleight of hand, who can tell? I mean, you can tell that people like Empedocles are tricksy characters, but they all have these reputations as being amazing healers. And whatever techniques they're using, healing is pretty cut and dry. Either you've healed somebody or you haven't. But in terms of the actual magical techniques and how they were transmitted, that's kind of a grey area until you get later on in history with very specific talismanic magic and stuff like that, very specific magical techniques. Okay, so the question is, where do we think alchemy came from? What are the roots of alchemy? And of course there's reference to Chinese alchemy and Indian alchemy, which appear to be entirely separate traditions. Chinese alchemy goes way back. Goes back, I think, to the Yellow Emperor. When was the Yellow Emperor? He's sort of 400 BC, I think, something like that. The focus on Chinese alchemy is the elixir of immortality, rather than gold making. There is the Indian alchemy, Rasayana, which is closely entwined with Ayurveda, particularly sort of Brahminic Ayurvedic traditions. and the focus on Rasayana is medical, but also specifically on the elongation, if that's the right word, of life. So the idea is to try and live as long as possible in order to pass go and collect 400 and not have to come back again. Because this is a key thing with the Indian understanding and also the Pythagorean understanding is the metempsychosis, as the Greeks called it, which is reincarnation. And it seems, I don't think I mentioned this in terms of the initiatory practices, but the encounter with the soul as a separate aspect of identity, a separate consciousness, separate to the body and what we might call the spirit, what in alchemical understanding becomes the spirit, Mercury, is one of the key initiatory factors. So the idea in Indian alchemy is to get through all your stuff and be able to do it in the time that it takes and have as much time as possible to do it in order that you can get off the wheel of rebirth and not have to come back again if you don't want to. Greek alchemy, it goes about, the oldest roots I can find are Empedocles. Empedocles is about 5th century, late 5th century BC, and he's the first one to name the elements, and he says there are 4 elements. And he doesn't name them directly as fire, water, earth and air. He names them as specific gods, deities, 2 female and 2 male, 2 couples as it were, presiding over fire and water as a couple and earth and air as a couple. But these are the 4 elements as we know them. And Islamic alchemy, there's an Islamic alchemical tradition which refers back to Empedocles as a direct source of esoteric knowledge in relation to alchemy. What we were able to glean in the West is still not that much. There are still loads and loads and loads of Islamic texts which are not yet translated, which may yield up more clues, but it seems to me that Islam preserved more of Empedocles' writings, and writings directly inspired by him, maybe pupils of, etc., maybe even a sort of chain of transmission. Certainly they've got more of that stuff than we have in the West, because what we have from Empedocles is very fragmentary indeed.
Guys, this is Sufi
yeah, this is an esoteric Islam. So yes, and it's not really until Zosimus, who I think is 1st century BC, isn't he? Sort of Egypt, Alexandria, that we get somebody who we can actually identify as an alchemist using techniques that we can recognize as alchemical, which appear to be certainly physical, happening in a laboratory. It's about putting certain substances through specific processes in order to achieve specific results, but he's also a visionary. He's also got these extraordinary visions. He writes about these extraordinary encounters with what we might call a homunculus. It's not really a homunculus, a sort of laboratory-made human being, in ways that actually isn't really sort of repeated in terms of its kind of bizarreness as a narrative until we get to the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, which is really quite like Zosimus. But then, from then, some people say that Zosimus is actually, this is all veiled, and all the metallurgy he's writing about is not really that. It's really writing about the spirit and the soul and trying to achieve union, because the alchemical idea is you've got this duality of 2 core sort of principles. which are sulfur and mercury, which are equated with soul and spirit. And it's the polarity of these two and their interaction and getting to grips with a struggle that appears to be going on between the two of them in terms of the inner alchemy. Then it's the antagonism that seems to crop up between the spirit and the soul, the sulfur and the mercury, and you see a lot of this expressed in alchemical imagery, particularly in the 16th century and mid-17th century alchemical emblem books, which exemplify this process of trying to achieve this union, this wedding of the two opposing principles. So in a nutshell, that's the roots of Western alchemy. We do know that there's some kind of transference. For example, Jabir, Hassan ibn Jabir, who was known as Geber in the Latin West, he's the first one to come up with the idea of sulfur and mercury as for the two substances. And whether they're randomly considered or they specifically are sulfur and mercury isn't clear, but what we do know is that when you make a compound of sulfur and mercury sulfide, you get vermilion. And vermilion is bright red, of course. We know it as a pigment, and is the colour. It's Chinese red, basically. It's Chinese red, the colour that they associate with immortality and inextinguishable life itself. And it's also the colour that the philosopher's stone is meant to be. And Jabir is supposed to have confected the stone. Legendarily, when he died, they discovered an anvil of solid gold in his laboratory. And it seems to me that he was certainly aware that the colour of the mercuric sulfide equated with at least the Chinese idea of the colour of the stone and the colour of immortality. Whether or not he'd actually seen the stone himself or confected it is an article of faith according to the individual. So there we go.
Do you think there's a relationship to Egypt and the origins of?
Yes, there certainly is. As I say, Zosimus was an Egyptian. He's the first one that we know of, and then there are various other people of sort of Greek Egyptians down the Nile, and they're definitely getting into alchemy, and that's definitely being fed into an esoteric Islamic current as well, maybe independent of the Empedoclean current. And there's, of course, this encounter with the Greek tradition and the Egyptian tradition, which is exemplified by Hermes Trismegistus, which is where the Greek god Hermes, with his winged sandals, and his caduceus, and being the god of communication, the go-between, the mediator between above and below, is in a strange way fused with the Egyptian god Thoth, who is the symbol of Watkins, and we're all sitting on a carpet with Thoth there with his scribe, ibis-headed. He's the scribe of the gods, and he is the communicator, and he's supposed to have invented language and invented magic and invented alchemy, and he's also said to have brought the gods into being himself. So he's the mediator between the gods and humanity, and in a strange way he is the arch alchemist himself, who has created everything himself, and he's just standing in the middle of it. So you get Hermes Trismegistus, who becomes an absolutely key, how shall we say, the tutelary spirit, actually, of alchemy and magic, certainly in the West, from the late Middle Ages onwards, certainly in the Renaissance, and firmly established by the time we get into the 16th and early 17th centuries. I mean, he's everywhere. When you look at 17th century Rosicrucian and alchemical emblems, you can't get away from Hermes. He's absolutely everywhere. And I think a lot of people who are here, many of you who have been following the esoteric, the Western esoteric stream, have probably developed something of a personal relationship with Hermes or the Hermetic current. And it's a current that works in many different ways and on many different levels. And particularly for practitioners, he's a strong current to draw on in many ways.